Look at the recently announced 15% tariffs by the US and what they mean for the trade deals that have already been signed with major countries. These tariffs have sparked concerns across the globe, with impacts on countries like India, the European Union, and South Korea. Let's break it down. On February 22, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Trump exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, striking down a key legal basis for the tariffs he imposed against countries including allies and foes alike. But in a not-so-surprised move, Trump did not accept the court's decision. Instead, he fired back with an executive order under a different trade law, Section 122 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, to introduce a blanket 10% tariff on all U.S. trading partners, raising it to a 15% levy the very next day. While this is being presented as a way to protect American industries, the move has already caused tensions with countries that have signed trade deals with the U.S. The big question now is what this means for deals that were already close to finalization or were just beginning to take shape. Let's start with the India-US trade deal. The US-India trade deal has been under discussion for months. Both countries were hoping to finalize a deal that would open up markets, reduce tariffs on agricultural products, and increase exchanges in technology and services. However, these new tariffs on steel and aluminum now put that deal at risk. India, one of the world's largest exporters of steel and aluminum to the US, will be hit hard. The tariffs could lead to a significant rise in the cost of Indian metal exports, undermining one of the key pillars of the proposed deal. According to reports, India is already considering plans to revisit the terms of its agreements with the US. However, the economic consequences of this could be far-reaching, impacting everything from agriculture exports to high-tech industries. Now let's look into the trade deal between the US and the European Union. The European Union was in the final stages of negotiating a massive trade deal with the US, which included opening markets, reducing non-tariff barriers, and increasing collaboration on technology and green energy initiatives. However, the recently imposed tariffs have put a damaging spanner in the works. The EU has been an outspoken critic of Trump's trade policies, particularly the tariffs on European steel and aluminum. Hence now, the situation is at a crossroads. European leaders who were already concerned about the US turning towards protectionism are now demanding the US reconsider these policies. They have warned that such moves threaten to undo years of diplomatic and economic relations. The striking point, the EU has made it clear that it will retaliate if the US does not back down. The European Commission has been clear. The US must honor its trade commitments or face the consequences. With that being the case, will diplomacy win the day, or will we see an escalation of tariffs and retaliation? Next is this US-South Korea trade deal. South Korea, a key US ally in Asia, had been looking forward to revamping the 2012 US-South Korea trade deal. Both countries had already agreed on working to reduce steel tariffs and opening more sectors to mutual trade, particularly in automobiles and technology. However, the US's new tariffs have now thrown a wrench in the works. South Korea is one of the biggest suppliers of steel to the US, and this new tariff could undermine both the existing agreement and the proposed new terms. In response, South Korea is now consulting with the US government to discuss how to move forward. Officials in Seoul are hoping to negotiate exemptions or modifications to the tariff policy. But if this fails, it could lead to a full reconsideration of the trade deal. South Korea faces a dilemma: to retaliate or to seek compromise. This could potentially lead to a shift in the region's trade dynamics, impacting everything from technology exchanges to the auto industry. So what does this mean for the world? The impact of Trump's new tariffs is not limited to the countries directly involved. These policies have the potential to rattle the entire global economy. If these countries like India, the EU, and South Korea respond with retaliatory tariffs, it could quickly spiral into a full-blown trade war. We could see global supply chains interrupted, rising costs for consumers, and a general increase in market volatility. So, what's at stake here is the very fabric of global trade. Many economists have warned that this move could undermine the trade recovery following the COVID-19 pandemic, slowing down growth and causing economic instability. At the same time, countries may be forced to look at alternative markets or make their own counter strategies to mitigate the impact of these policies. The big question remains, can diplomacy prevail, or will the world face a new era of tariffs and trade wars? The big picture is this: Trump's tariffs could shift the global trade order, and the ripple effect will be felt by companies and consumers alike. But will these countries bend, or will the US become more isolated in its economic approach? The coming weeks will be crucial. For this, we welcome Mr. Erik Solheim. He's a former minister of Norway. Thank you very much, Mr. Solheim, for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting time in global affairs for sure.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for joining us. Now, first and foremost, as a politician and as an international affairs expert, I'd like to know your reactions on the latest tariffs.
I think the core issue here is that it's very, very hard at this point to trust the United States, because Trump imposed tariffs one day, then he got this setback with the Supreme Court, then imposed some new tariffs, and there is no certainty as to what the future will bring. I mean, the new tariffs will for sure be brought into the court system in the United States, and no one knows what will be the outcome of that. The Congress may be involved, which will make it much more difficult for Mr. Trump, and some of the new laws he will try to apply may also make all tariffs more temporary. And when the European Union or India or South Korea makes a deal with Trump one day, and the next day everything is undermined, because it makes it very, very difficult to trust any deal for the future.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that, Mr. Solheim. And now, by imposing a blanket 15% tariff on steel and aluminum, the US appears to be trying to bypass the US Supreme Court's decision. Since India and South Korea have existing preferential trade status, does this move effectively signal the end of the rules-based order in favor of a power-based order, where bilateral leverage is the only currency that matters?
Well, of course, the so-called rules-based order in the past was also very much exaggerated. There was always a balance between rules and power. In the case of Trump, power is the more dominant and rules seems to take the back seat. But look, any trade deal is a give and take. For example, when India went into this trade deal, it wanted to sell its aluminum and steel to the United States. It accepted some hard bargain from the United States on agriculture. As in Prime Minister Modi have been widely criticized for accepting some of the American terms on agriculture. But this is a give and take, it's a balance. He, of course, then thought that he got more on steel and aluminum than he lost on agriculture. But if this balance is undermined, of course the trade deal will fall apart, and exactly the same with Europe. Europe thought it had a deal, then Trump is undermining everything, there is no deal. And I don't think Europe tomorrow will jump into a new deal. Look, I think also everyone realized that the one nation which has got the best deals with the United States are China, because China stood up to Trump, it didn't bicker, it was very clear, it looked into its bargaining power, and China is the nation the United States most respect, more than it respect Europe or India, even if Europe and India traditionally has been much closer partners with the United States.
Thank you for highlighting that. And now, in the light of the recent tariffs imposed by the US, how do you foresee the European Union's response evolving, particularly with regard to retaliatory measures and the long-term implications for the EU-US trade relationship?
I think Europe has reached a watershed moment, and that watershed moment was really in the Davos talks in January, when of all persons, Prime Minister Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, said what nearly all Europeans think, but very few people have been brave enough to speak out. And that is, Europe needs to define its own positions. Europe needs to be much stronger. Europe needs to get the self-confidence as a civilizational state, or at least group of states. And Europe needs to really look into its spine, not be weak and not bicker every time. And I think Europe now will stand much firmer up to Trump than it did until very, very recently. Last year was a shameful year for Europe, where Europe flattered Trump at every occasion. That has come to an end. It will not continue. And I think Europe will take its time to judge and not rush into any new agreement with Trump until there is some certainty that it will last.
And the European Commission has hinted at rebalancing measures targeting iconic US exports if the EU moves from surgical strikes on specific goods to a broad-based carbon border adjustment or digital services tax. Could we see this trade spat evolve into a permanent structure rift that makes a future transatlantic free trade area mathematically impossible?
Well, obviously, the rational answer from Europe to Trump is to surgically put tariffs on those items which adhere to the voters of Mr. Trump. I mean, all agriculture products from the Great Plains of the United States. I mean, these are core vote banks for the Republicans and Trump. Europe stopping importing from these people will, of course, hurt Trump with his voters. And we have a very strong response. And I think you will see a lot more of this, because people understand that only by hitting back you can get the respect, which get you into a bargaining position. I hope that still rational minds will be supreme, both in China, India, Europe, everywhere, and that the Indian-American relationship and Europe-American relationship will survive. But it can only survive on the basis of the strength of India and the strength of Europe. That's what we will see now.
Yes, indeed. Great learning from you, Mr. Saleem. Thank you very much for joining us on this timely topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was all for this episode of Deep Dive. Stay tuned for more.